Great. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This webinar is part of our series on the new or the revised 2025 PCPCH recognition criteria that will be implemented starting in January. So we are talking today about PCPCH standard 3 or 4C, which is the organization of clinical information. So it's all about your EHR. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues who are going to share information about that standard. And then we'll have plenty of time for your questions at the end. If you have any, please drop them in the chat. So I'll turn it over to Suzanne and Susan.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Almanci, and I'm a Program Operations and Policy Analyst with the Patient-Centered Primary Care Home Program.
And I'm Suzanne Jefferson, an Improvement Specialist with the PCPCH program. And we want to thank you for joining us on our webinar on PCPCH Standard 4C.
All right, so first, just a few webinar logistics and Zoom etiquette reminders. The webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the PCPCH program website. If you are having any technical difficulties, please private message Amy Harris for help. If you feel comfortable, please have your camera on and put your name and organization info up top. Any questions or comments you have can be put in the chat and we will answer them during the question session. And here's the agenda for today's webinar. I'm going to start by providing a brief overview of the 2025 PCPCH recognition criteria. Next, we'll deep dive into PCPCH Standard 4C, Organization of Clinical Information. Next, we'll share additional PCPCH resources and upcoming learning collaboratives. And lastly, we'll have some time for your questions. The Patient-Centered Primary Care Home Program was established in 2009 by the Oregon Legislature as part of the state's broader health system transformation strategy to improve access to care, reduce costs for patients, and improve population health. The standards are developed in partnership with an advisory committee and have been revised 5 times since 2009. The 2025 PCPCH standards were developed to support OHA's strategic goal of eliminating health inequities by 2030. The standards specifically help primary care practices build their capacity and processes to address inequities in their patient population. All practices applying or reapplying for PCPCH recognition after January 1st, 2025 must meet these new standards. For more information, I would encourage you to watch the recording of the 2025 PCPCH Standards Overview webinar, which is on our website. Okay, so today I'm going to review PCPCH Standard 4C, Organization of Clinical Information. PCPCH Standard 4C is in core attribute 4, continuity, which from a patient's perspective means to be our partner over time in caring for us. Regarding the intention of Standard 4C, implementation and use of electronic health record technology is essential for achieving many advanced primary care home functions, such as improved population tracking, care coordination, communication, patient safety, and health equity. Maintaining comprehensive and up-to-date patient records that are easily transmissible to other clinicians and facilities as patients move throughout the healthcare system fosters safe transitions of care. Including select demographic characteristics in a patient's EHR can help PCPCHs provide high-quality care and services that are more specific to patients' background and health needs. Understanding patient demographics information is important to address inequities. So for Standard 4C, this is a must-pass standard. Practices must, at a minimum, meet Measure 4C0 to qualify for recognition. For 4C0, PCPCH uses an electronic health record technology that is certified by the Office of National Coordinator for Health Information Technology Health IT Certification Program and includes the following elements: a problem list, medications list, allergies, basic demographic information, preferred language, BMI percentile or growth chart as appropriate, and immunization record. PCPCH updates this EHR as needed at each visit. Again, this is a must-pass standard. This standard is also progressive, which means practices can select the level that best describes their practice with a maximum of 10 points. For 4C1, a PCPCH documents their patient's race, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity in their electronic health record. This measure is worth 5 points. For PCPCH measure 4C2, PCPCH meets a benchmark for the percentage of patients with their race, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity documented in their electronic health record. This measure is worth 10 points. Please note that the benchmark for measure 4C2 was developed from the technical advisory group for this measure, as well as guidance from our health equity consultant, Ignatius Bao. A practice is meeting measure 4C0 if it uses an ONC certified electronic health record, which it updates as needed at a patient visit. The EHR must include the following elements: standardized problem lists, medication lists, allergy lists, immunization records, basic demographic information, for example, their name, address, phone number, insurance information, patient-defined and designated family or caregivers authorized to access the patient's personal health information and other contact information. Primary language and other communication needs, and for example, this would be for individuals with disabilities, BMI, BMI percentile, or growth chart as appropriate. These elements should be recorded in a consistent location in the EHR, and the practice should have a clear process for ensuring that they are regularly reviewed and updated by staff. The biggest change to this measure that we wanted to note is that the EHR certifying entity was updated from CMS to ONC. A practice, so for some examples, a practice uses an ONC EHR or certified EHR and has a workflow to regularly review each patient's problem list, medication list, allergies, basic demographic information, primary language, BMI, BMI percentile and growth chart, and immunization record. Some examples may include a medical assistant reviews medications at each visit, front desk staff verify demographic and insurance information at check-in, an MA updates a growth chart at each well-child visit, and nurse-administered immunizations are documented on the immunization flow sheet. The practice also asks all patients what name and gender pronoun they prefer and documents this information in the EHR. For measure 4C0, as you're completing your PCPCH application, we strongly recommend that you gather and collect all documentation that would be needed for a site visit. At a site visit, you would be required to show this documentation to the PCPCH program to demonstrate you are meeting the measure. For measure 4C0, you will just need to provide proof of EHR certification.
Thanks, Susan. Now I'll cover the specifications for measure 4C1. A practice is meeting measure 4C1 if it's meeting the specifications for measure 4C0 and has a process for documenting one or more of the following patient characteristics in their EHR: race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Practices may either collect this information from patients directly or partner with external organizations to obtain this data about their patients. Practices should ideally take steps to ensure that this information is collected, stored, transmitted, and accessed in a way that is patient-centered, trauma-informed, and considers the privacy and safety concerns of their unique patient population. Providing this information should be voluntary for patients. On this slide, we'll review an example for measure 4C1. A practice collects and documents its patient's assigned sex at birth and gender identity in their EHR. To reduce data collection and fatigue, the practice partners with CCOs and other private insurers to collect its patient's sex assigned at birth. The practice collects gender identity data directly during patient registration and as part of the electronic check-in paperwork. To help promote trust and engagement, the practice includes a brief introductory note for patients, families, and caregivers on the purpose of collecting this data and how it will be used, as well as it being completely voluntary. Here's another example of measure 4C1. A pediatric practice collects and stores information about its patient's disability status during new patient registration and/or check-in paperwork using pediatric-specific disability assessment criteria and EHR capabilities. The practice ensures that its patients and families understand that providing this information is entirely voluntary. At a site visit, you would be required to show this documentation to the PCPCH program to demonstrate your meeting measure 4C1. Here's what you will need to provide. 1, a policy, procedure, or workflow for obtaining and documenting at least one of the patient characteristics described above. And 2, a snapshot or example of a form, database, or other mechanism through which this information is obtained. This could be intake forms, patient check-in forms, a data file provided by an external party, etc. A practice is meeting measure 4C2 if it's meeting the specifications for measure 4C0 and meeting a benchmark for the proportion of its patients that have one of the following characteristics documented in their EHR: race, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Benchmarks are included in this table on the slide. As you can see, the benchmarks for race, ethnicity, and language are 80%, and the benchmarks for disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity are 50%. Please note when calculating your proportions for measure 4C2 that the numerator is the number of active patients who have the select characteristic documented in their EHR. The denominator is all patients currently meeting the definition of an active patient. Note, practices that distinguish between patients who have not yet provided demographic information for a specific category and those who have indicated they intentionally prefer not to provide information for that category may exclude the latter from their calculations. Practices that do not distinguish must include all active patients in the denominator, including those for whom their information is unknown. We want to highlight that the intent of this measure is not to make patients feel pressured to provide this information. If the practice feels that collecting information on a particular category would put undue pressure on patients to provide information that could pose safety risks for them or make them uncomfortable, then we encourage practices to choose a different category that works better for your patient population. The best practice box on page 102 of the 2025 TA Guide includes some guidance on how to collect data in a patient-centered and trauma-informed way. On this slide, we have an example of measure 4C2. A practice has 2,045 active patients, which it defines as any patient that had at least one visit in the last 24 months. Of these active patients, 1,054 of them have their sexual orientation documented in their medical records, or 52% of the practice's patient population. The practice is therefore meeting the benchmark for the percentage of patients with documented sexual orientation, which is 50%. Reviewing the documentation required for this measure, this is what you would need to provide to the PCPCH program during a site visit to demonstrate you're meeting the measure. 1, a policy, procedure, or workflow for obtaining and documenting at least one of the patient characteristics described above. 2, a snapshot or example of a form, database, or other mechanism through which this information is obtained. Again, this could be intake forms, patient check-in forms, or a data file provided by an external party, or etc. And 3, the data used to calculate performance on the benchmark. This concludes our presentation on Standard 4C. We do want to let you know that we're hosting this webinar series to assist practices and other community partners in understanding our standards. Webinars are scheduled every other Friday through December, and you can find a complete list of topics and registration information on our website. The next 3 webinars are listed on this slide. We hope you can join us, but if for some reason you can't make it, we will be recording and posting these webinars on our website. Our final slide here before we jump into some Q&A is some resources that we think you may find helpful. So the first is our PCPCH program website. The second is the 2025 TA Guide, which includes detailed information about how to implement every measure and the documentation requirements. Next is a link to our TA resources webpage. Next is the community engagement report and evaluation. And lastly, you're always welcome to reach out to us via our program email that's listed here on this slide.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne and Susan, for that presentation about 4C. So you guys provided great information as usual. So I'd like to just open it up to any questions or comments or feedback that folks on the call, participants on the call might have about this standard. There's nothing in the chat, so if folks want to unmute themselves or raise their hand, they are welcome to do so. It's perfectly okay if there's no questions. I do know for many of these measures that folks are sort of really just now sort of diving into the specifications. And so it could, of course, be that you have questions that come up as you're reading through or you're thinking about how to implement this in your practice. And if that's the case, as Suzanne said at the end of the presentation, you're always, always welcome to reach out to our program at any time. Rachel, who you see on the screen here, is the one who answers our PCPCH email. And she does a great job at answering our questions or answering your questions. And if she doesn't know the answer, she always reaches out to one of us. Sometimes we even have staff consultations about questions that come through because we don't always know the answer. So we try to work together to get you the best answer. So again, always feel as though you can reach out to us at any time about this standard or any of the standards in the model or any questions that you have about how to apply or how to be part of the program or how to meet specific standards. So I'll pause there and just see if there's anything folks want to ask. Okay, looks like there is. Okay. So Gloria asked the question, I missed what is the documentation we need to provide? So maybe we can pull back up the slide deck, unless Suzanne or Susan, you can recall that.
For which measure?
That's a good question. You could show them all. Oh, yep. Oops. Oh, good. So as you can see for 4C0, you would be required to show, that's the must-pass measure, just proof of your EHR certification. So that's pretty straightforward. For 4C1, you can see this is the documentation for that. So it's a policy, procedure, or workflow about how you're obtaining the information and documenting it for at least one of the patient characteristics described in the measure. And then also a snapshot or some kind of form or example of how you're collecting that information. So like it says there, intake forms, check-in forms. If you're sharing data with an external partner like your CCO, we would want to see like how you're getting that information from your CCO on that demographic data on your patients. And then for 3C or 4C2, the first two are the same pieces of documentation for 4C1, and then the additional information that we would like to see is the data that's used to calculate performance on the benchmark. And we have in the technical specifications guide how to do that calculation. It's step by step in there. So we just need to see how you did that. So I hope that answers the question. Great. And Gloria said all, so good. And then somebody asked Jordan that if she could ask a question about 1E2. Sure. Yeah, that's not what we're covering today, but that's totally fine. Yeah, absolutely. So Jordan, if you want to unmute yourself, I have the TA guide pulled up, so I'm gonna just refresh myself. If you want to ask your question, go right ahead. Okay, so she says, I was wanting, oh, it looks like I was wanting to see what other clinics were using for proof that patients can access their EHR through the portal in their language. That's a good question. And that did come up during that webinar, if I recall. So what you're asking is that, so one of the requirements, I'll just refresh everybody about what that standard is. So that is the standard that requires practices to make sure that practices have the ability through your EHR portal to access their information in either a language that's not English, so their primary language, or has the capabilities for if they have a disability and it's difficult for them to read that information, they can access it in an accessible way for them. So what you're asking is that how does the practice demonstrate that their portal has these capabilities, and especially in the other languages? And that actually came up before during this webinar, as I mentioned, because if I'm remembering it correctly, and I'm asking my team to remind me if I'm wrong, but I think for most portals, this is something that the patient can just click on a button that translates it for them. And so how do you really show that from the practice perspective? And I think at the time, somebody was saying like, well, we can't really see that view that the patient view has. And I can't recall what we discussed. I know we have it documented in our notes, but I can't recall what the outcome of that was. Does anyone have a recollection of that? What that documentation would be?
Well, there's a couple different options in the TA guide under what kind of documentation we'll accept. So we could have a screenshot, when I was in clinic and I had a site visit, this was over a decade ago, but I had a test patient. And so I would use that test patient to go in and see the portal from the patient view and then take a screenshot of that showing it's available in another language. So that's one way that you could do it. Also, we would accept a policy, procedure, or workflow describing how the patient's primary language, if it's not English, how they're able to access online. So we'd also take a policy, procedure, or workflow of how you are educating your patients that it is available in their language. If it's a flyer that you give them, if it's a handout, if it's in your new patient paperwork, however you're doing that, that's another way that we would accept it.
Thanks, Amber. Is that helpful? I hope so. I don't know. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, good. Jordan says great. Perfect. Thank you. Great. Good. Let's see here. Let me go back up and see if there's any. Okay, so it looks like there's another question or comment related to that measure, so 1E2. So the measure just says in an accessible format. I wasn't sure if this was specifically related to language or if it had anything to do with the access to the technology itself, device, phone, minutes, internet. Oh, that's a good question. I hadn't considered that. Does it have to do, so from our perspective, when the measure was written and when we wrote the specifications, we were really thinking about it from the patient's perspective of accessibility related to either language or disability. But we hadn't really thought about like, do they have a device that even, do they even have a smartphone or even a way to access the internet, or what kind of connectivity might they have to do that? I think that's out of the scope for this measure, but I would really want to maybe talk with my colleagues and maybe get back to you about that. I think it's really difficult from a practice perspective to ensure that all your patients have those sort of technology that they have it accessible to them. We know there's a lot of technology barriers across our state, especially in our rural communities. And so I think that's a really great point and wasn't something we were thinking of in this measure, but let us go back and kind of think about it and get back to you. But again, my first kind of gut reaction is like, it's probably a little out of scope for most primary care practices to be able to address that or monitor that. But I'd also turn to my team and say, I don't know, what do you guys think about that? Does anybody have any initial reactions right away? No. Okay.
I'll just say that I do agree that it is out of scope for our specifications as they're currently written, but it is something that we would encourage thinking about if you have the capacity to do so.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rachel. Okay, other questions? Either about this standard or others? Okay. Well, great. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today on Friday. Nice Friday. And again, if you have any questions about this standard or others, feel free to reach out at any time. We truly are here. And we are really quick. Rachel is super fast in her responses. So definitely feel like you can always reach out. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.